Well, last time we were together 2 weeks ago, we saw how Jacob had left Laban. He'd built up his wealth and his flocks, and he'd left Laban's home and had done so secretly. He didn't tell Laban that he was going. He was heading back to his own land of Canaan. And we were told that Rachel had stolen her father's household gods. And so when it came to Laban's attention that Jacob had left, Laban went off in pursuit and finally caught up with Jacob, and they had this confrontation in which Laban accused Jacob of stealing these household gods. Jacob didn't know anything about it and invited Laban to search through their possessions, and if he found those gods, then whoever had them would be put to death. But the gods remained hidden in Rachel's tent. Laban didn't find them, and so finally the confrontation ended with Laban and Jacob coming to an agreement with each other. Laban would go back home, and Jacob would continue on his journey to the land of Canaan. And so at the end of chapter 31, we had Laban saying farewell to his grandchildren and his daughters, blessing them and departing and going home, whilst Jacob took his family and all his possessions, and they continued on their journey. So we pick up the story here in chapter 32 this evening, and we're going to try and get through 2 chapters here, chapters 32 and 33 tonight. So we'll read chapter 32, verses 1 to 21, which says, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's army. So he called the name of that place Mahanaim. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. Say to my lord Esau, Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now, and I have oxen, asses, flocks, men servants and maidservants, and I have sent to tell my lord, in order that I may find favour in your sight. And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and 400 men with him. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him, and the flocks and herds and camels, into 2 companies, thinking, if Esau comes to the one company and destroys it, then the company which is left will escape. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who did say to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness which thou hast shown to thy servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 companies. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and slay us all, the mothers with the children. But thou didst say, I will do you good, and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So he lodged there that night, and took from what he had with him a present for his brother Esau, 200 she-goats and 20 he-goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels and their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 she-asses and 10 he-asses. These he delivered into the hand of his servants, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass on before me, and put a space between drove and drove. He instructed the foremost, when Esau my brother meets you and asks you, to whom do you belong, where are you going, and whose are these before you? Then you shall say, they belong to your servant Jacob, they are a present sent to my lord Esau, and moreover he is behind us. He likewise instructed the second and the third, and all who followed the droves. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you meet him, and you shall say, moreover your servant Jacob is behind us. For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes before me, and afterwards I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So the present passed on before him, and he himself lodged that night in the camp. So when Jacob resumes his journey after the confrontation with Laban, he has an experience in which he's met by the angels of God. And when he sees them, he proclaims, "This is God's army." You'll remember that he had seen angels in his dream when he first left the land of Canaan to go to Laban. Back in chapter 28, those angels which were going up and down the stairway into heaven. And now on his return, again, he sees this great number of angels. He says this is God's army. And he gives the name of this place where this happened as Mahanaim, a word which means two camps or two armies. So perhaps he's thinking of the angels being one camp and his own company being the other camp. Jacob was obeying God's commandment for him to return home, and God had promised to be with him. God made that promise back in chapter 31 and verse 3, when God said to Jacob, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." So God is keeping that promise, and the sight of the angels would have given Jacob the assurance that God's presence was with him, that he is being accompanied on this journey by the army of God. And often angels are depicted as providing that sort of protection to people. In Psalm 34 and verse 7, we can see this here. Psalm 34 verse 7. Psalm 34 verse 7 says, "The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them." The psalmist there speaking of that protection. That's David in that psalm saying that the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them, providing that protection. And then also in Psalm 91 verse 11, "For he will give his angels charge of you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone." So again, the angels providing protection there. And then we have an interesting story in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 15 to 17, concerning Elisha. Elisha was being hunted by the Syrians who were after him, and he had gone into the city of Dothan. 2 Kings chapter 6 verse 15 says this, "Well, the Syrians have come up and they've surrounded the city where Elisha is hiding. When the servant of the man of God," that's Elisha, "rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was round about the city." That's the Syrian army. "And the servant said, 'Alas, my master, what shall we do?' He said, 'Fear not, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them.' Then Elisha prayed and said, 'O Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see.' So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha on that occasion." And this something similar going on here with Jacob as well, when Jacob sees this great army of these angels saying, "This is God's army," providing him with that protection. The matter that now concerned Jacob, though, was a meeting with Esau. He knew that he needed to seek reconciliation with his brother, and Jacob had originally left home because Esau had wanted to kill him over the issue of the birthright and the blessing. And although many years have now passed since those events took place, Jacob must have still felt some anxiety about returning. How would Esau regard him now? Did Esau still want to kill him? So in order to prepare the ground for a possible meeting, Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, and that's down to the south of the Dead Sea. At the time, Jacob instructed the messengers on what they were to say, Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now, and I have oxen, asses, flocks, men servants and maid servants, and I have sent to my Lord in order that I may find favor in your sight. So those were the words that the servants were to say to Esau. And in those words, we see that Jacob addresses Esau respectfully. He refers to him as my Lord, and he refers to himself as your servant Jacob. And he seeks to reassure him that he presents no threat to Esau, that he has everything that he needs, all of these flocks and all of these animals. And he simply seeks to find acceptance and favor in Esau's sight. So the messengers then returned from Esau, and they told Jacob that Esau was coming to meet him, and he was bringing 400 men with him. Well, this news then made Jacob more afraid and distressed, and he must have assumed that Esau was coming with these 400 men with hostile intentions. So in order to protect his flocks and his household from attack, he divided them into two groups, thinking that, well, if Esau attacked and destroyed one group, at least the other group will have the opportunity to escape and survive. So with a sense of urgency, Jacob then prayed to God in verses 9 to 12 of Genesis chapter 32. He begins by addressing God as the God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac. And then he addresses God as Lord, O Lord, using the name Yahweh. He reminds God in the prayer that God had told him to return to his own country and kindred and had promised to do him good. Referring to himself as God's servant, Jacob acknowledges that he is an unworthy recipient of the steadfast love and the faithfulness that God has shown towards him. He recognizes that he doesn't deserve any of this. He had left home, he says, and he crossed the Jordan with just a staff. He'd left home with next to nothing. And now he's coming home. He's returning with 2 companies of people and with flocks. And this is all because God has been gracious towards him. And so now he prays that God would deliver him from the hand of his brother Esau. He admits that he is afraid that Esau would come and kill them all, including the mothers and the children. And perhaps that's an indication of the opinion that he had of his brother. He still sees him as posing some sort of threat and danger to himself. And Jacob ends the prayer by recalling the promise that God had made. He says, but thou didst say, I will do you good and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Of course, that was the promise that God had originally made to Abraham, repeated it to Isaac, and then again repeating it to Jacob as well. So Jacob is holding on to that promise that God had made. So although he's afraid of what Esau might do, Jacob is being sustained by that promise of God and holding on to that promise. So Jacob lodged there for the night, stayed the night in that place, and in anticipation of the meeting with Esau, he prepared an extravagant gift for Esau. He took animals from his flocks and his herds. There were 200 she-goats and 20 he-goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels with their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 she-asses and 10 he-asses. So it's a substantial gift that he is putting together here. And he gave these animals to his servants, instructing them to separate the animals into different groups or different droves. And they were to continue on towards Esau with a gap between each drove of animals. When they met Esau and he asks them who they are and where they're going and who owns these animals, they are to say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau, and moreover, he is behind us. Jacob again refers to himself here as a servant of Esau and refers to Esau as Lord. So again, he's being respectful in the language that he is using, that he sees himself in that relationship. And Jacob hoped that this gift then would appease Esau or make atonement for the wrong that he had done, and that Esau would see his face and he would accept him. A literal translation of the text in verse 20 would say, I will see his face and perhaps he will lift up my face. So Jacob wishes to see his brother face to face. And the size of this gift is really an indication of the damage that Jacob acknowledges that he has done by depriving Esau of the birthright and the blessing. So Jacob is trying to put things right by putting together this. So the servants then went on ahead with these gifts while Jacob remained in the camp for that night. We read on now in chapter 32, reading verses 22 to 32. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and Jacob's thigh was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, Let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, What is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, Your name shall no more be called Jacob, but Israel. You have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, Tell me, I pray, your name. But he said, Why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed them. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his thigh. Therefore to this day the Israelites do not eat the sinew of the hip, which is upon the hollow of the thigh, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh on the sinew of the hip. So that night, then Jacob took his family across the ford of the Jabbok, the river, along with all of his possessions, and he left them on the other side, whilst he remained on his own. Perhaps he wanted some time alone in order to prepare for this meeting. The Jabbok River runs west from the Transjordan Plateau on the eastern side, running into the River Jordan. And whilst he is there on his own, a strange experience occurs in which Jacob finds himself wrestling with a man. And this wrestling match went on until daybreak. When the man Jacob was wrestling with saw that he did not prevail, he then touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh and put it out of joint. Although injured by this, Jacob still clung on to his opponent. And the man then asked Jacob to release him because it was daybreak. But Jacob refused to let him go unless the man blessed him. And in asking to be blessed, Jacob was acknowledging that the one that he was wrestling with was greater and stronger than him. So the man asked Jacob, What is your name? And he told him his name was Jacob. And the man then said, Your name shall no more be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. The name Jacob, as we've mentioned before, means supplanter, one who is a deceiver, and the name has been associated with Jacob's deceptive tricks. But now he's given this new name, the name Israel, and this is the first time the name is used, which means God fights, or you have fought with God. And this is the name which would be used of the nation that would arise from Jacob's descendants. So it's both a personal name for Jacob, a new name for him, but it will also be the name of his descendants who will form that nation of Israel. name from Jacob to Israel indicates the power of the one Jacob was wrestling with, and also the change of character and relationship which the new name brings. Jacob becomes a new person after this encounter. It is, we might regard it as being his conversion experience. No longer would he need to resort to deceptive tricks in order to get his way. He was to recognize his reliance upon the grace of God. The prophet Hosea refers to this incident in Hosea chapter 12, verses 3 and 4. Hosea chapter 12, verse 3. Of course, the book of Hosea is really God's judgment upon the nation of Israel because of their unfaithfulness. And verse 2 says that the Lord has an indictment against Judah and will punish Jacob according to his ways and requite him according to his deeds. That's referring to the nation. And then referring to the person, to Jacob himself, chapter 12, verse 3 says, in the womb he took his brother by the heel, and in his manhood he strove with God. That second line of verse 3 is a reference to that wrestling match. In his manhood he strove with God. He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He met God at Bethel, and there God spoke with him. The Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord is his name. So you, by the help of your God, return, hold fast to love and justice, and wait continually for your God. That little reference there to this incident in Hosea. Jacob then asked the man to tell him his name. Tell me, I pray, your name. Jacob has given him his name, so perhaps he thinks, well, I'll ask his name as well. Tell me, I pray, your name. And in knowing his opponent's name, he would know the person that he had been wrestling with. But the man did not give his name, but simply asked, why my name? The man then blessed Jacob, and Jacob then named the place where all of this happened as Peniel, meaning the face of God. Pene is the Hebrew word for face, and El is the name, the word for God. So put them together, Peniel, meaning the face of God. Because we're told it was there that Jacob said, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. So Jacob understood that this struggle he had endured had been with God himself, and yet he had survived. And so he was now prepared for this meeting with Esau. He realized the strength that God could give him, that God was with him. And so when the sun rose, Jacob passed Peniel to rejoin his family, and we're told that he was limping because of the injury that had been inflicted to his thigh. So this limp would be a reminder to Jacob of his encounter with God and the new name that God had given him. The chapter ends in verse 32 with a little note explaining that this incident provides the reason why the Israelites do not eat the sinew of the hip, which is upon the hollow of the thigh. So that's a sort of later tradition that must have developed. So it was that part of Jacob's thigh that had been touched. So a food regulation was instituted sometime later in memory of Jacob's encounter with God on that occasion. 33 and see the continuation of the story here, verses 1 to 11. We'll read first of all here, Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 11. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. And he put the maids with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. When Esau raised his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the maids drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And last Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company which I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, I pray you, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand, for truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God. With such favor have you received me. Accept, I pray you, my gift that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it. So the morning after his wrestling match with God, Jacob finally saw Esau coming towards him with his 400 men. And in anticipation of the meeting, Jacob organized his family with the maids Bilhah and Zilpah in front with their children, followed by Leah and her children, and in the rear, Rachel and Joseph. The order here seems to be according to their status. Rachel, of course, was Jacob's favorite wife. And Jacob himself went in front of all of them, and as he approached his brother, he bowed to the ground 7 times. His action demonstrates his respect for his brother and also his repentance. And the trepidation that Jacob must have felt at the prospect of this meeting was soon forgotten. When Esau ran to meet Jacob, embraced him, fell on his neck, and kissed him. A bit like the father running to the son who comes home in Jesus' parable of the lost son, the father who ran out to greet his returning son. So Esau runs to meet Jacob and embraces him. It's a very emotional scene that we have here. And it was a greeting that Jacob could not have anticipated, given that Esau had wanted to kill him those years earlier. And both brothers then wept, overcome by the emotion of the occasion. When Esau regained his composure, he looked up and he saw the women and the children, and he asked who they were. And Jacob was able to say that they were the children that God had graciously given him. And he refers to himself again as Esau's servant. The mothers with their children then came forward, each in turn, and bowed down to Esau, beginning with the 2 maids with their children, followed by Leah with her children, and then finally Rachel and Joseph. And Esau then inquired about the flocks and the herds that Jacob had sent on ahead of their meeting. He says, "What do you mean by all this company which I met?" Jacob says that they had been sent in order to find favor in the sight of my Lord. Again, he shows respect by referring to Esau as my Lord. But Esau tries to decline the gift, saying, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Whereas Jacob referred to himself as Esau's servant, we notice that Esau refers to Jacob as my brother. Jacob urged Esau, though, to accept the gift. He says, "If I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand." The acceptance of the gift, that everything was okay. So Jacob says that to see Esau's face is like seeing the face of God because of the favor with which he has been received by Esau. And so he urges Esau to accept the gift because of God's gracious dealings with him and because he also has enough. And so with this, Esau then finally accepts Jacob's gift. And so this reconciliation is brought about, this friendship is re-established. And forgiveness and reconciliation had been the outcome of the meeting here on this occasion. And reading on here, the last verses of the chapter from verse 12 to the end, then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go before you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the flocks and herds giving suck are a care to me. And if they are overdriven for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on before his servant, and I will lead on slowly, according to the pace of the cattle which are before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." So Esau said, "Let me leave with you some of the men who are with me." But he said, "What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord." So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth, and built himself a house, and made booths for his cattle. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Paddan Aram. And he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohoi Israel. Esau then proposes that they should continue on their journey together, with Esau leading the way. But Jacob expresses his concern for the children and his flocks if they are driven too hard. So he tells Esau to go on ahead, and he will follow on at a slower pace, pace more manageable for the cattle and the children, he says, until I come to my Lord in Seir. Esau suggested that he should leave some of his men with Jacob. But Jacob says there's no need. So Esau left, and he returned to his home in Seir, whilst Jacob journeyed to Succoth, where he built a house and shelters for the cattle. And from the direction, it would seem that he really had no intention of joining Esau there in Seir. The name Succoth means booths or shelters. And we're not told how long he stayed in Succoth, although the building of a house would perhaps suggest a more permanent settlement. But eventually from there he continued his journey into the land of Canaan, and he came safely to the city of Shechem, where he set up camp before the city. So God's promise to bring Jacob back to this land was fulfilled. That was the promise that God made when Jacob left back in chapter 28 and verse 15. God had said to him, "Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done that of which I have spoken to you." So God's promise has been fulfilled now. Shechem was where Abraham had settled when he first came into the land of Canaan, which is mentioned back in chapter 12 and verse 6. Jacob then purchased the land where he had set up his tent from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, paying 100 pieces of money for that plot of land. And there he set up an altar, and he called it El Elohoi Israel, which means God, the God of Israel. So he's using his new name there, not referring to God as the God of Abraham or the God of Isaac, but rather to himself, the God of Israel, that the Lord is his God now. And so Jacob fulfilled the vow which he had made at Bethel when he had left, that if God would be with him and watch over him and bring him back to the land, then the Lord would be his God. And so we come then to the end of this story, of Jacob's return, and it's an emotional story at the end here, and it's one that provides great encouragement for us. There's a few things that we might reflect upon from the story here. What can we learn about reconciliation from the experience of Jacob and Esau, these two brothers who had been hostile towards each other, and yet at the end of the story here we see forgiveness and reconciliation and friendship coming about? How had God blessed Jacob? God had made promises to Jacob, and how were those fulfilled, and how had God blessed him? And how would you describe Esau's character in all of this? That from the earlier accounts, as a younger man, he had seemed not interested in his birthright or the blessing, and then regretted it. And here at the end, we see him acting in a very gracious way towards Jacob. So we'll stop here